All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Welcome back to our automation mini series. This is part two, continuing on from what we had last week. Normally, we have our basic, advanced webinars for our labeling products once a month. But here at Techlinks, we realize there's a lot more to learn about the labeling world than just the software. So because of this, we launched a series of training webinars focused on specific topics that we expect most of our current users to face, or topics we feel could probably improve your current labeling process. So today's webinar is going to focus on Sentinel, which is one of our automation enterprise products that's used to automate printing and is a lot more robust, more feature-rich than what we looked at last week in CodeSoft. So coming into this webinar, there's a little bit of expected knowledge. Our basic and advanced webinars for the label design products, basically those take you through how to create labels, get you started in all of our different software products. We're continuing on in this week, CodeSoft, the labels. CodeSoft is what we're going to be using today. So we looked last week at what steps we can take there to automate. Today we're going to be taking a deeper dive. So I'll be starting in CodeSoft and then moving quickly over to Sentinel. And Sentinel is only compatible with our CodeSoft labels. So if you're not working in CodeSoft right now, maybe you're in LabelView or Label Matrix or another platform, stick around just so you can kind of see how Sentinel works and get a feel for some more advanced enterprise automation. So to introduce myself a little bit, just so you know who's talking at you all afternoon. My name is Scott. I work on the enterprise team here at Techlinks. I've been here for about 3 years. When I'm not labeling, I'm usually out playing volleyball with my friends on the grass, on the beach, or indoors. And I actually grew up in California, been living in Wisconsin for the last 7 years. So if you were on our webinar last week, Rob went from Wisconsin to Arizona. So I kind of traded spaces with him, going from the warm weather to the cold weather. Before we get started once more, we have a few housekeeping items to go over. We have a live moderator for our webinar today. You might have noticed that all headsets are muted just to kind of keep the line noise down. You guys can hear me clearly enough. So if you have any questions throughout, go ahead and open up that chat window and go to webinar and send a question. Tony will be the guy answering those. There he is right there. So any questions that you have throughout, feel free to shoot those over and Tony will be answering those. And anything that require a little bit more of an in-depth answer, I'll answer at the end as well. And finally, we have a survey that we'll send out after the webinar is over. Just if you could fill that out to give our team some feedback, that would be awesome. So now that we have our housekeeping items in place, let's go ahead and look at the agenda for what we're going to be talking about today. First step is going to be identifying the manual steps in your current labeling process. So anything that you're doing today that might be taking up extra time or error prone, we'll be looking at those. And then moving into looking at Sentinel, how we can configure it to listen to your ERP or other business system for a flat file or a table update to actually trigger a print job automatically based on what is in that print request. And finally, we'll finish up with a Q&A after the live demo. So if your gears are turning during that demonstration, we can answer some of those questions afterward. So talking about Sentinel, what is Sentinel? Sentinel is a middleware or a listening application that receives print requests from other systems. So the purpose of Sentinel really using it is to listen to requests very quickly and then automate the printing based on what those requests have in them. So it can be used to integrate directly into your business system to print to a couple hundred labels, a couple hundred printers, kind of whatever you need in a matter of seconds. And Sentinel is much faster than any print user can be. So I'll be looking at Sentinel. What would Sentinel be replacing? So as far as manual steps, a pretty common process from what we see on our side is a user gets a request that, hey, we need to print this label. So they would go to a separate design software, open it up, browse for the right label that they actually need to print, select the printer that it needs to go to, whether it's out on the warehousing floor, the production floor, wherever that might be, populate the quantity of labels that they need to print, actually click print, and then finally pray that it's right. So the file open print pray method, quote unquote, that we kind of refer to here. So this is what we want to avoid as far as manual steps go, because one, it's time consuming and also pretty error prone. There's a lot of places where users need to make decisions or fat finger anything. So that's what we want to avoid is our manual steps. So how do you actually eliminate those manual steps? Those would be limiting the number of decisions the user has to make, as well as interactions with any kind of interface. So along with that, browsing through hundreds of templates potentially, depending on how many parts you have or orders, we can manage to fewer templates. And the idea here is, of course, to save time and money, because if you're printing faster, users are taking quicker time or not as much time to actually print labels. You're kind of just saving all around, whether it's time, money, efficiency, all that good stuff. So how do you automate? What's an example of automation? One could look like, if your users are interacting with an ERP system or WMS system all day, it takes away from their workflow to have to open up another program to actually print a label. So an example of automation could be hitting print directly in that ERP. If they're looking at an order or a part, just hitting print in there. That action could trigger an event to drop a file to Sentinel or update a record in a database that Sentinel is watching, that would then read that data and then execute a print job based on what you see there. So that's kind of what we're going to look at today. And talking about, different WMS ERP systems, we've been deliberately vague on what system that is, because of the fact that Sentinel can hook into any ERP or WMS or pretty much any business system that you have. The nice part about Sentinel is that it's agnostic to all those things. As long as it receives a request, it doesn't matter necessarily where that request comes from. It can process that request and then spit out a print on the other side. So if you're going through, a few different ERPs or an ERP upgrade, you don't have to upgrade Sentinel or do much work on the Sentinel side at all, as long as we can maintain that handshake. I realized I was on mute that whole time. Sorry about that. So basically what we're going to do here in this training demo is take a look at Sentinel, just show you what it looks like to configure Sentinel, how it looks from a user perspective as well as an administrative perspective, print using a pseudo ERP that I mocked up myself by generating a flat file, as well as updating a record in a database to show off what kind of actions need to be taken on the Sentinel side to make that happen. And we recognize all labeling environments are different here. These are just going to be some common examples or setups that we just, something to get the idea to hit home. But if you have any questions, the gears are turning, you're thinking, will this work for my environment? Or maybe working for a customer's environment, we're happy to get on the phone with you to talk it out and make sure everything kind of lines up the way it should. So getting into the demo here, let me pull up my environment for us so we can take a look. And so it's coming up here. Alrighty, so what we're looking at right now is CodeSoft. CodeSoft is where you're going to be designing all the labels, kind of what we mentioned earlier, and last week we were working in CodeSoft a lot. The idea here is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to be using what's called a table lookup variable to pump data in from a table that I have. So to look at that data quickly, there's a part number. I'm entering a part number over here on the right, and we're actually going to be passing this value through in Sentinel as well. and that is linked up with different fields on the label. So my description shows up down here, my size and other extraneous data. We have an image as well. So what's happening is we're using the part number to pull all that data onto the label, which we talked about in last week's webinar using table lookups. One of our moderators will send out a link to last week's just in case you missed it, so you can watch that and review it to go over table lookups. So as I change this part number here, for example, we're going to get a different part. So taking a look at the demo itself, we have our ERP up here. This is what a user is going to see from a printing perspective. They're working in their ERP. This is a little bit of a rudimentary ERP, but it'll work nonetheless. If we want to enter a part number that we want to print, so we'll say 200, 400, we want to print 3 of those. I'll hit print here, and then that'll actually result in a PDF print on the other side. And there's our printout. I'm printing to a PDF just so you guys can see it, and not just printing it to a printer sitting next to me and telling you it looks good. So there's our part number 200, 400, and printed out 3 copies of it. So what is actually happening on the other side here? I'll pull up Sentinel. This is our Sentinel, the manager, which is what an administrator would interact with, as well as another folder, which is our watch directory. So what's happening here, my ERP, my user is taking action in the ERP. I'll stop Sentinel from watching so we can take a look at what's happening. And I'll generate a print job. So that's by my user interacting, hitting print, and out comes a drop file. And what is a drop file or a flat file? It's not as technical or crazy as it sounds if you've never heard of it. It is simply a file that you can open up in a notepad or any text editor, really. It's got data in here. In our case, it's just pretty straightforward. It has our label that we want to be printing, the part number that we need to be printing in there, as well as the printer and the quantity of labels. So this is, you might notice, all the information that you would give to a print user if they were just printing out of CodeSoft. Say, hey, I need you to go open up this label, use this part number on that label, print it to a PDF, and print 4 of them. So all this same information that we're passing to Sentinel is the same stuff you would be passing to a print user regularly. So this has to exist somewhere. It's just now in the form of a flat file. And ours is pretty explicit. It can be a CSV, it can be an XML file, it can be anything really structurally, because Sentinel is very configurable, I guess is the right word here, to read any incoming data file that we need to put out. So our ERP is putting out this file. I've set up Sentinel to read that. So this file now is sitting in this directory that this watch is configured to look to for any files. So as soon as I turn it on here, you'll notice Sentinel will do a little blip in the parsing state and it prints it out. Now my PDF driver is a little bit slower than what Sentinel can process, but out comes my PDF on the other side with the part number that we wanted, as well as the quantity that we wanted of 4. Which is pretty neat because, and what we saw kind of initially, the print user doesn't even know that Sentinel or CodeSoft or anything like that exists. They just know that they're interacting with SAP or JD Edwards or whatever they're actually using to hit that print button. But what they know on the other side is it doesn't matter really because the labels are coming out. So from a user perspective, it's a lot simpler and a lot easier from a training perspective as well. And so there's our labels. So that is an example of printing to a flat file or printing from a flat file coming out of your ERP. Another option we have is actually setting up a table in either a SQL Server, Oracle Server, any kind of database server, creating a table in there that our ERP can interact with, or some other program can actually add a record to a table and Sentinel can watch for that same information just in a different format. So I'll open up a table here for us. What we have here is pretty much that same information. If you ignore the first 2 columns for a minute, you'll see we have our label name, we have our printer name, a quantity, and the actual part number or the other data that needs to go into our label. So this is the same information just now in the form of a table. The first 2 columns here are for the nuts and bolts of actually setting up the Sentinel and having Sentinel monitor this table. So we'll go through that right now. So to create a new Sentinel, I'll just hit create a new Sentinel here in the Sentinel manager. For the name, we'll call it database. and the group will call it webinar. So the group itself is just for organization purposes. We can sort by our group and it'll show up in our view here. For the input process, we don't want to use the file capture. There are a few other options here we won't go over, but the database watch is what I'm focused on because this is my table that lives in a database. So I'll select it and hit settings. This prompts us to initially connect to our database. We'll go kind of top to bottom here from this interface. So we'll connect, and I'll enter my database information. Make sure we have the right provider here. So this is actually for ODBC drivers. We want a SQL Server driver because that is the table I have here. So we'll enter our server name. Our login information for that server. And then the database on that server that my table lives in. I just created a database called Sentinel. This is not a requirement. This can be, an SAP database or an AX database or any kind of database that you have. I just named it Sentinels for us so we can kind of know where we're going. So that's all looking good. So now that we've connected to that database, I want to point to my table. So that all the tables in my database will show up in this dropdown. And we just have one to make our lives easier. So it's just called Data Watch Delimited. We get a little preview of our data down here as well. In this same interface, this is now where we're mapping Sentinel to say, hey, this is where the label name is going to show up, or the printer name, or the quantity of labels. So we can just map those fields right next to those control variables. We can say the field that defines the printer name, or I'm sorry, the label name is label name. The field that defines printer name is just called printer name, and the field that defines the label quantity is called print quantity. So those are 3 of our 6 columns kind of taken care of. The other 3 come down here after the preview of our table. The method for processing is reading and writing to a process status field, and that's what that status is. So the 0 in here we know means not processed. A 1 means in process, which is a really quick 1 because Sentinel processes so quickly, and then it'll go to a 2 once it's eventually processed. So our unique identifier field is the one all the way here on the left that just goes 1 to infinity. Is just increments by 1 to say this is the unique record for this job. So we can say UID is our unique identifier, and the status field is our process status. And finally, we didn't forget about you, part number data, that comes down very last. I'm just saying, hey, where is the data going to come in? It's going to come in this column, and it's going to be delimited and assigned by equal signs and semicolons. So we can have, if we had more than one when printed field on our label, we could put multiples in here. So if we had like a lot number or anything like that, that maybe isn't defined in a table, but part of just the print process, we can put that in this column as well. So now that we have our SQL Watch set up, we'll hit OK. So that's all looking good. And our process tab, what is essentially the result of this record being added to the database? We want that to be a print of a CodeSoft label. We don't need anything else happening. We just want ink on paper, or in our case, ink on a PDF as the final step. So I'll go ahead and hit OK here, and my watch is now created. So I can enable it and start it, and what's going to happen when I start it, because we have a record that already exists in this table, it's going to process it right away. So when I hit start here, you'll notice Sentinel will do that same parsing blip and pass it, and then spit out our print on the other side in the form of the PDF. And it looks pretty similar to what we were doing before because it is exactly the same result. The data is just now coming into Sentinel in a different way. We're passing our same part number that we've been using, our 200-400, and it's printing out a label in accordance to the other data that we found in that table. So it's printing this out, and we had a quantity of 1. So if we wanted to get creative here, we could use a part number 200-700 and print out a quantity of 6. I created a little bit of movie magic here so that all these other fields would fill in automatically. So then Sentinel will still do the blip down here, pass the label. We can see these got filled in, and we caught it, we refreshed it while it was still in process. So there's that 1 status, it'll switch to a 2 as soon as I refresh the table again, just like that. So there is our PDF that we just printed out, part number 200-700, and there's 6 copies of it. And so naturally, this table watch would not be, another user interacting with this table directly. They wouldn't be adding records by themselves, but they would be doing something similar to what we looked at a moment ago with another ERP system, or the same one, just updating a record in a table. Once again, user has no idea that a table is being updated or a flat file is being created. They just know that they're just hitting print somewhere. Or alternatively, is they don't have to be interacting at all. Say, for example, an order comes into SAP and that triggers an automatic procedure that would then send a table record to this table or create a flat file. So then the user down on the floor, they don't actually need to interact with anything. It's all handled automatically on SAP side. They just know that they need to start doing some work when the labels start coming out, as an example. So we're flexible in how everything happens. Right now, we're just kind of showing you kind of in the granular nitty-gritty of what is actually happening. But from a user perspective, they don't need to know anything. And from a technical perspective, as long as we get our file or we get a record in that table, then we can make printing happen. How that gets there, it doesn't really matter. And that's what makes Sentinel so flexible, is that we can create, maybe there's a few different systems, one that creates a drop file and one that watches the table. You notice we have a couple watches down here. We can have as many watches as we like, but that is just, however many different print processes we have, we can configure Sentinel to look to those. Cool. So I'll come back to our PowerPoint here. That's kind of the demo we wanted to show you. So bring us back to the PowerPoint. Cool. So kind of to recap what Sentinel is, there's a case study that I actually worked on myself. One of my roles on the enterprise team is implementing Sentinel for other companies. Our moderator just send out a link to this case study that we did with Dot Foods, but essentially Dot Foods, a very large player in the food industry, they had a very manual process for printing. It was very similar to what we looked at earlier with someone opening a label design software, finding the label, which was one of hundreds of labels. They weren't driving the data dynamically like we were. It was each label had static information. They went to go find that label, pick the correct printer of hundreds of printers, and then they needed all those labels at the same time to come out to the right printer and the right quantity so they could work with the requirements set out by the FDA. So what I helped with in this implementation, we used their WMS system, JDA, to automate printing in the form of a flat file. So the one we looked at first before the database watch. So everything kind of comes out automatically, goes out on their lines. They're first printing way faster than they were before because users don't have to make decisions. It's all done by JDA. And secondly, the reliability of that data is much higher because users weren't accidentally selecting the wrong part number or wrong product number or entering the incorrect data by fat finger. So Dot Foods is a great example of kind of encapsulating everything we've talked about, going from a manual process to an automated process with Sentinel. And to recap a little bit here, just kind of what we looked at, what we were talking about. We set up Sentinel to, first we saw actually the ERP itself, or our quick sample ERP, create a flat file for Sentinel, what the user actually saw, and then taking a look at what was actually in that flat file, setting up Sentinel to look to a table for actually triggering the print, and then kind of just going back and forth and talking a little bit more about how Sentinel is reading that information and where that data comes from. It doesn't matter. So it can be SAP, Oracle, any Sage, any ERP, or maybe it's a homegrown system that you have as well. As long as Sentinel can get its hands on that data, it'll spit out a print job on the other side. So get into a question and answer here. I'm going to launch a poll for us initially. What this poll is just to kind of get temperature of the water and how you guys are feeling about the two different methods we looked at. So I'll launch that now. You should see in a second the pop up on your screen, whether you want to trigger prints by adding a record to a table or generating a flat file, which kind of makes the most sense for either your environment or your end user's environment. We'll keep this open for about 30 seconds, maybe a minute, just to kind of make sure you have time to think about it and pick the right answer. So once again, the flat file or the record to a database both come from either an ERP system automatically calling a subroutine when something comes in, or by a user hitting print in that same system. So anything that you can set up a routine for, saying, hey, we want to use this method after that action happens, that action being the vague action. It looks like we have about half the folks answering. You guys, if you're still thinking, you know, definitely keep those wheels turning. We'll close in about 10 more seconds or so. Cool. So we got about 60%, a little more than half. I'll close it. Take a look at the results here. It's split a little bit, 58, a little more leaning towards the flat file, and that makes sense. It really depends on the architecture of what system you guys are using. So whether it's SAP, which is primarily driven by SQL tables, it makes sometimes more sense from a programmatic side. The setup is a little bit easier to do it from a table versus something more homegrown, or maybe you don't have a database system in the back. The flat file makes a little bit more sense. So either one, like we saw, works. It's kind of good to get the temperature of the water there. Cool. And so any questions, keep firing those off to our moderator, Tony. He's been answering a couple. He's also put a few over to me to kind of answer myself here. So let me pull that up. Cool. So we'll get question in here. The Sentinel keep records of how many print jobs are coming through. The short answer is yes and no. If you have that table there, the way that we were looking at it was Sentinel was keeping track and saying, hey, this was record number 1, record number 2 with that unique identifier field. So you can look at that table and have a pretty complete print history just based on that table itself. So looking at that, you can see on this day at this time, this was printed just because of the table itself. If you want something a little bit more in depth, we have another product called Label Archive, which actually holds, who printed it. You can reprint those old print jobs that were printed either from Sentinel or out of CodeSoft. Kind of anything you need in there. Label Archive is tracking all that history data a little bit more in depth, but from a short answer, yes, if you're using the database watch, and not so much if you're using the actual flat file. Good question here from Alejandro. Is Sentinel a separate piece of software or is it embedded? The answer is it's actually it's a print service that leverages CodeSoft's print engine. So how it works is it's just that it watches and then it calls open the CodeSoft file and passes the data through and prints it. So it is an add-on to CodeSoft. So if you're using CodeSoft, it's pretty easy to actually bolt Sentinel on there and use the labels that you're using today. Or if you're using Label View or Label Matrix, we can convert those up to CodeSoft and get you on the CodeSoft platform with Sentinel. Question here as well, what assistance or help does TechLinks provide to integrate to ERP systems like SAP or JD Edwards? We can definitely help on the side of kind of being the handshake. So meeting you halfway on, this is what we need. This is what the data could look like or should look like. It's really a collaborative process that we take as part of the implementation. So that's one of my main roles as well, is going through that process, implementing Sentinel, talking to your SAP developers or whoever your in-house developer is or manager of SAP or JD Edwards, saying, hey, what can you put out in the form of a flat file or a table? And then I would be the one working with you, or one of my teammates working with you on, yeah, we can do that. Maybe we get it in this location, or how does, kind of the architecture of how everything works. We're with you every step of the way to get the handshake to happen. Another good one here. How many printers can Sentinel print to at once? Is there a limit? And the short answer is no. You can have as many printers as you actually have in your environment on there, whether they're all locally and you're in your intranet or your wide area network. The limit that really plays a part is just the resources on the server. So if you have a server that's beefy enough to handle thousands of print requests, sometimes a minute, to print to thousands of other print requests, that is certainly a possibility. Just making sure that the hardware can support that. So the server itself having enough processing power and memory. Using Sentinel to print labels in different countries. I guess I kind of touched on it a moment ago, but actually using a wide area network. So as long as, I guess the short answer is, as long as the Sentinel server can see the destination printer, whether that's by IP address or a DNS entry or anything, so long as the server is able to see the printer that it's going to and send the print code to it. So whether that's over a wide area network or a VPN, that's definitely possible. In some cases as well, because of across countries, sometimes across continents, one thing to take into account is the latency of that potential latency of the VPN or the wide area network. Sometimes it makes some more sense to have individual Sentinel servers on those continents and then spit out labels across that continent. In other cases, if the latency is acceptable, or if it's just set up in the right way, you can have one Sentinel server handling all of those different printers across countries or continents. And a question here about the version of CodeSoft or Sentinel. Sentinel goes back pretty long ways back. I think one of the earlier ones that we're still working with is Sentinel 10, but that was a long time ago. So 2019 is the current version of Sentinel and CodeSoft. Like I said earlier, they go together. You design labels in CodeSoft, that's the design suite, and then the actual printing engine or the print server would be Sentinel. So those versions are 2019 is the most recent. But if you're working on an older platform, we can help get you on the new one and have those work in tandem with each other. So another good question here, using CodeSoft and access to populate the fields on the label. So similar to what we were looking at earlier with that part data being populated with my part number that I put in, that is exactly what I was using, is actually CodeSoft in an access database. So the print request held the part number, which was my primary key for that data. And then that was actually being pulled from CodeSoft. So the label intelligence is still intact with all those table lookups and any formulas you might have on the label. So the short answer being yes, it can. Sentinel, using the flat file, can pull that data from the table, and that's just based on what you have set up on the label already. Good question about change control, actually, and this kind of comes back to label archive, what I touched on earlier. If we're talking change control of the data itself, so for example, that data in the table, That's a little bit outside of the scope of what TechLink software does. That data is usually managed by the ERP or some other process. So we don't touch the data itself, but change control for the labels, Label Archive, which is another one of our enterprise products that can bolt on with CodeSoft and Sentinel. It offers revision control, so you can see your different versions of labels as they evolve throughout the life of that label, as well as role assignment and approval processes. So say, for example, Tony, who's our moderator today, he is my manager, he's QA. I am just a design user. So whenever I create a label or make a change from an existing label, that is submitted to him in an electronic approval workflow that actually goes through and is once he actually approves it, that's when it's being printed in production. So change control on the label side, we can manage that with something called Label Archive, and Sentinel will then print those managed templates. But the data itself is usually managed by another system. We'll wait for a few more other questions to come in here. Cool. And I know I'm infamous for it as well. As I'm thinking about it and the meeting ends, as soon as the meeting ends, I have about 5 questions about something. So don't worry about it. If something comes up in your brain or if you want to bring it up, we're going to leave the questions open for a little bit after the webinar closes, so we can get all those questions and make sure we get an answer to you. So our moderators will send out a link to CodeSoft as well as Sentinel for a demo. If that demo is actually a trial, it's fully functional for 30 days. So as you install it and download it, if you have any questions at all during those 30 days, you're under our trial license, so you can give our tech support a call. They can help you with actually setting that up and any questions you have. How do I connect to my table? How do I create a label? Anything like that. You can get that help from our support team, which is the numbers there, or our support site. Our knowledge base is pretty extensive on how to do certain things like adding a printer or stuff that you might have questions with initially. So our support.techlinks.com. So our moderators will send out a link for that. And then finally, thank you very much for joining us today. This is some awesome information. I have a certainly passion for labeling, smart labeling. So this was a lot of fun to talk about. Thank you for coming and joining us today. And like I said, we'll leave the questions open for a little bit longer so you can get those in. But until then, thank you very much and have a good day.